Welcome back, Boss Economics fam. It's your boy, the no-nonsense, number-crunching, government-skewering host of Boss Economics World, here to break down the latest economic dumpster fire and expose the clowns in charge who keep pouring gasoline on it. Buckle up, because today we're diving into the dollar's nosedive, America's ballooning deficits, and the Trump administration's masterclass in mismanagement. And trust me, this isn't just for the finance bros in the back, this is for every hard-working taxpayer who's sick of watching their future get flushed down the drain. Let's get into it. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, the dollar is tanking faster than a lead balloon, folks. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index just dropped 0.4% on Wednesday, May 21, 2025, hitting a 2-week low and marking its third straight day of decline. Now, for the uninitiated, that might sound like a tiny blip, but in the world of global finance, this is a screaming red flag. And guess what? All eyes are on the Group of Seven, G7, meeting, where traders are sniffing around for any hint that the Trump administration is actively trying to trash the dollar's value. Spoiler alert, they probably are. Now, let's talk about what's really going on here. Japanese Finance Minister Katsunobu Kato, bless his heart, is out here begging for currency talks with his U.S. counterpart, Scott Bessent, because Japan is sweating bullets over the yen's strength against a weakening dollar. South Korea's already jumped into the fray, admitting they've been huddling with the U.S. to discuss currency issues. Why the panic? Because a weaker dollar means stronger currencies for their trading partners, which screws over their export-driven economies. But here's the kicker, the Trump administration seems totally cool with letting the dollar slide. Why? Because a weaker dollar makes U.S. exports cheaper, and Trump's all about that America first rhetoric, even if it means torching the dollar's global credibility. But hold up, before you start cheering for cheaper, made in the USA widgets, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. A weaker dollar isn't just a trade hack, it's a symptom of a much deeper, much uglier problem. And guess who's to blame? That's right, the folks in Washington who can't stop spending money they don't have. Let's talk deficits, baby. If the dollar's decline is the symptom, then America's runaway budget deficits are the disease. And let me tell you, this disease is terminal if we don't get our act together. The latest drama? Legislators are bickering over a massive tax cut package, with Republicans trying to cap the revenue losses at a modest $4.5 trillion over the next decade. Oh, but don't worry, in its current form, the loss is only $3.8 trillion. Only. That's like saying, hey, I only set half the house on fire, chill out. Meanwhile, Moody's just downgraded U.S. debt last week, citing, and I quote, a failure to halt a trend of large fiscal deficits. Gee, you think? Let's put this in perspective with some fresh, piping hot data. According to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, the U.S. federal budget deficit for fiscal year 2024 hit a staggering $1.8 trillion, that's 6.4% of GDP, folks, and the highest deficit to GDP ratio since the COVID-19 spending spree. Fast forward to 2025, and the CBO projects that number could balloon to $2 trillion if these tax cuts go through without any serious revenue offsets. Oh, and don't forget the national debt, which just crossed $35 trillion in 2024, according to the U.S. Treasury Department. That's over 120% of GDP, higher than at any point since World War II. And what's the Trump administration's plan to deal with this? More tax cuts, more spending, and apparently, a weaker dollar to paper over the cracks. Genius. Now, here's where it gets really spicy. Mo Sim, an FX strategist at Bank of Singapore Limited, dropped a truth bomb when he said, rising fiscal concerns are fueling a combined rise in long-end U.S. yields and dollar decline. Translation. Investors are getting spooked. They're starting to wonder if lending money to Uncle Sam is such a hot idea when the U.S. government is spending like a teenager with a stolen credit card. And when investors get spooked, they demand higher yields on U.S. Treasuries to compensate for the risk, which pushes up borrowing costs, which makes the deficit problem even worse. It's a vicious cycle, folks, and we're spiraling right into it. Now, let's talk about America's twin deficits, the budget deficit and the trade deficit, because they're back, baby, and they're bigger and badder than ever. For those of you who slept through Econ 101, the twin deficits theory says that when a country runs a big budget deficit, it often leads to a big trade deficit, because the government has to borrow money from foreign investors to finance its spending spree, which pumps up the value of the dollar and makes imports cheaper and exports more expensive. But here's the twist, under Trump, we're seeing the opposite, a weakening dollar despite massive deficits. Why? Because investors are starting to lose faith in America's ability to pay its bills, and they're dumping dollars faster than you can say, tariff tantrum. Let's crunch some numbers to drive this home. According to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. trade deficit hit $1.1 trillion in 2024, a record high, fueled by a flood of imports and a sluggish recovery in exports. Meanwhile, the budget deficit, as we've already established, is on track to hit $2 trillion in 2025. That's a combined twin deficit of over $3 trillion in a single year, folks. For context, that's more than the entire GDP of countries like Canada or South Korea. And what's the Trump administration's brilliant solution? Push for a weaker dollar to boost exports, even if it means higher inflation, higher borrowing costs, and a potential crisis of confidence in the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Slow clap. Now, let's bring this down to earth for the regular folks watching at home, the hard-working taxpayers, small business owners, and savers who are getting crushed by this economic clown show. A weaker dollar might sound great for exporters, but for the rest of us, it means higher prices for everything we import, think oil, electronics, clothing, you name it. And guess what? Inflation is already rearing its ugly head. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Consumer Price Index, CPI, rose by 4.8% year-over-year in April 2025, the highest rate since the early 1980s. A weaker dollar will only pour fuel on that fire, eroding your purchasing power and making it harder to afford the basics. And let's not forget the inequality angle. Who benefits from a weaker dollar and massive tax cuts? Not you, not me, but the ultra-wealthy and the big corporations who can park their profits overseas and dodge taxes like it's an Olympic sport. According to a 2024 report from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, the top 1% of earners captured 85% of the benefits from the Trump-era tax cuts, while the bottom 60% saw their after-tax income rise by less than 1%. Meanwhile, the federal government is borrowing trillions to finance those tax cuts, piling debt onto future generations, your kids, my kids, everybody's kids. It's generational theft, plain and simple. And here's the kicker, all this economic instability is happening against the backdrop of a global economy that's already on edge. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, just slashed its global growth forecast for 2025 to 2.8%, citing, you guessed it, policy uncertainty, in the US as a major risk factor. From China's slowdown to Europe's energy crisis, the world is looking to the US for stability, and instead, we're giving them a front row seat to a fiscal train wreck. So, let's wrap this up and call it what it is, a textbook case of government mismanagement driving us straight into an economic ditch. The Trump administration's obsession with tax cuts, trade wars, and a weaker dollar is a recipe for disaster, and the data backs it up, soaring deficits, a tanking dollar, rising inflation, and a Moody's downgrade that's basically a neon sign saying, get your money out of here. And don't even get me started on Congress, where the only thing bipartisan is their love of spending money we don't have. Here's the bottom line, boss economics fan, when the government prioritizes short-term political wins over long-term economic stability, we all lose. And until we get leaders who understand basic math, you know, like, don't spend more than you earn, we're stuck on this roller coaster to Recessionville. So, what can you do? Stay informed, hold these clowns accountable, and maybe, just maybe, start hedging your bets against the dollar. Because if Washington keeps this up, we're all going to need a plan B. Alright, that's it for today's episode of Boss Economics World. If you're as fed up as I am, smash that like button, subscribe, and leave a comment below, what's your take on this dollar debacle? And hey, if you're a finance pro, drop some knowledge for the rest of us. Until next time, keep your wallets tight and your eyes open, because the economic circus isn't slowing down anytime soon. Peace out.